Theology 101 seeks to share information and insight into the various topics of the Catholic faith, which deal with God, the Church, the sacraments, and other issues. Your program host is Father Jim Korda.
Hello and welcome to our show, Theology 101. I'm Father Jim Korda. Today we're going to talk about music, worship, and liturgy. Joining me today is Father Jack Lavelle. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
You know, when we talk about worship, music, and liturgy, that's kind of a lot, but we're going to break it up. Let's talk first about music. We all have heard that cliche, to sing is to pray twice. Why is music so much a part of our liturgy, and why has it always been so much a part of the actions of who we are as God's people?
Well, I think on one level, again, it is that sense of lifting and raising our voices to heaven. But I think also there's a very human dimension in that. And I take it back to being in school and having to memorize certain things. Oftentimes you'd use these pneumatic devices, but sometimes they'd almost take on a little sing-songy, sure. You'd kind of put things to music and then in your mind, you'd be able to remember these things. Mm-hmm. And so, you'd have kids in final exams all kind of humming along something because that was how they best could remember. Mm-hmm. So we also put ourselves, and little kids who can't read can remember songs. They can sing these songs. The melody and the harmony and all of that just kind of plays together to make it work. So if you want to go back to an early church as it was evolving, certainly not, I don't think the disciples on Easter Sunday were singing too much, though we want to think that Alleluias were emerging. Right. But as you look at an early church that was for the most part illiterate, who didn't understand the language as even the church evolved, this was a way in which they really could offer themselves, in celebration. While they didn't know all of the Latin that emerged and developed, they could sing certain songs, they could know certain melodies, and it also then kind of brought them into the celebration.
Well, music really has been part and parcel of our whole human culture. Mm-hmm. Even going back to the Hebrew people, when we look at the Psalms, all 150 Psalms, they were basically sung. They weren't recited. And so music has and always will be part of our celebrations, part of good times and bad times. We sing when we're happy. There's that song that we sing when we're sad. And so music is so much a part of who we are. When we talk about music in liturgy, though, why is it important for us to always have music as part of liturgy? We know over the many years that we've been in ministry that we've had celebrations of Mass and liturgy where we do not have music. Some of that is appropriate, and at times it's not appropriate. Why is music so much part of liturgy? Well,
again, I think it goes to the sense of celebration, the importance of it. But I think also what you mentioned, music helps us to evoke certain moods and set the tone for certain celebrations. And as you said, music that would be appropriate at one season is not appropriate at another. Sometimes the absence of certain music also sets the tone. I think the example of during Lent and Advent, we don't have the Gloria. During the Lenten season, we don't sing the Alleluia prior to the Gospel or in any dismissal. So I think it does help to set the tone of the seasons and the celebrations and the solemnities. Again, it also allows us that opportunity to unite with the Scriptures, not just in the Psalms, but I'm always amazed at people, or not amazed, I don't mean to belittle, but that don't have an understanding of how we choose what we do or even how the songs are written. And they'll come, did you know that song matched up perfect with that reading? Well, because it's based on that reading, that most of our music is the Bible set to a melody. So again, it is that praying twice, but it's helping us understand but also just the rhythm and the tone, and it really invites a greater celebration. We've all been to liturgies that have been deadly, that either have had the absence of music or have had it done horribly wrong. I can't sing at all. And yet, one of my favorite phrases that somebody used one time was, "I don't know good liturgy, I just know when I don't get it." And I think that's true of music, that's true of everything going on, that we might not know all the rubrics and the rules and be able to do all that, but it all comes together to create this beautiful sense of celebration.
What's interesting as you were talking, I remember a priest liturgist once saying that sacred music is really poetry put into song. Mm-hmm. And if you read it without the music, it is very poetic. And so there's that whole sense that we use all of the best things of our thoughts and language to do what we do in the celebration of the liturgy. Mm-hmm. And let's remind the folks what liturgy means. Mm-hmm.
Well, a very basic definition is that it is the work of the people. It's all of us coming together, offering our gifts and our talents to praise and to glorify God. Liturgy is much broader than the celebration of the Mass. The liturgy, the hours, praying. One of the things, that is one of the things that, priests and religious promise to keep faithful is praying the liturgy of the hours. And yet, to be perfectly honest, they're never as beautiful as when you're in the seminary or when you're in community with brothers or sisters, because the larger community that's doing that liturgy of the hours, we're singing those psalms, we're praying those prayers. Again, while we might be able to evoke and remember some of the poetry of it when we're praying it by ourselves in the morning or evening, it's never as beautiful as when it's brought together. But there's other liturgies. There's nights to honor Mary, or a prayer service, even at the funeral home without the Mass. So liturgy is any time that we're really coming together. We're bringing the work of the people together to praise and glorify God in a certain structural sense of song and scripture and prayer.
Let's talk about that word worship. We use it when we talk about a God or Jesus, or we worship something that we really like or love. Why is that word worship so important for us when we talk about the liturgy or the celebration of the Mass or sacraments? What are we worshiping, and who are we worshiping?
Well, for us as a Christian Catholic people, we only worship God. We worship God in the Father, Son, and Spirit. Oftentimes, people of other faith traditions will kind of think we worship Mary, or that we worship the saints. We venerate the Blessed Mother, and we venerate the saints. But that worship is really reserved for that way in which we express our thanks and our praise and our glory of God in the Father, Son, and Spirit, that sense of worship. Now, again, any word can be used in other ways. We will, we worship at the altar. But how often do we hear people then use that phrase, oh, he worships at the altar of golf, or he worships at the altar of his greed, that we have made. And what that really means is, not only have we made something else our God, but our whole life is offered in direction toward it. And sadly, I think that misuse of that gives us the best definition of what it really means to worship God. That our whole life, whether it's when we're at Mass, or whether it's when we're doing our prayers privately, or whether it's we're taking the blessing of the ability to do labor and work, our whole lives should be directed in glorifying and praising God in what we say and what we do. And so that really is our worship. Does it find its reality in specific ways at Mass and in prayers and in devotions? Yes. But really, our whole lives should be that liturgy and that worship of praise of God.
Let's go back to something you had mentioned about music being done well, and sometimes it's not. Let's talk about how when we gather to worship, it demands our whole self. our whole consciousness. And sometimes we are so distracted with everything else that's around us. You know, even for us as presiders of the worship, of the liturgy, sometimes we have to be very careful we don't get distracted, that we put our whole selves into it. And oftentimes if you talk to a brother priest, after they celebrate Mass, one of the things that they experience is tiredness, because it does take a lot out of you if you put a lot into it. Why do we get distracted, and what can we do to kind of like help ourselves not to be distracted when we gather for worship and music and liturgy?
Well, again, I think the design of our, if we want to just look at the Mass, if we use the celebration of the Eucharist, it does involve the whole person. I sometimes refer to as the Catholic calisthenics, but you know, within the Mass, we sit, we stand, we kneel, we sing, we pray. The part we're not good at, moments of silence. How often, and we could devote a whole segment to that, but it would be awfully quiet. But you know, the way in which, as human beings, we don't do well with silence. You know, to just silently reflect for a while, someone's always got to start talking. And the liturgy itself calls for moments of silence, which I think are juxtaposed with the moments of singing and the moments of praying. But all of the elements come together to invite the whole person to be actively involved in. We should be a little tired, you know, because if we're fully actively participating, again, the language of the Second Vatican Council, if we're offering full, active, and conscious participation, we're using our whole selves to glorify God. You know, we're using all of our senses. One of the things I love most about the Easter Vigil is if there's any Mass that envelops all of the senses, because we smell the flowers, but we smell the chrism. You know, we feel the water from the sprinkling rite. We taste the Eucharist. We see the fire that's blessed and as the lights come on. You know, but all of our liturgies are really asking us to use all of our senses and all of our abilities and all of our blessings, you know, to praise and glorify God, if done right. You know, and we all get into those moments where, and you're right, we all do that. I catch myself, and it might be the busy hecticness of our day. How many times are people sitting out there in the pew or even kneeling, and you can look real holy, but you're running through your grocery list, and you're remembering you got to run to the mall, and this has to happen. And how many times have I caught myself, because I do it day in and day out, like driving to work, did I stop at that stop sign? Did I say that prayer? You know, but then you're thinking, oh, I got that funeral tomorrow. Oh, you know, it's tragic. What am I going to say? And then you have to pull yourself back in. And we really have to, it takes conscious effort to stay involved in the celebration.
It does. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but we need to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Available through St. Paul's Books and Gifts is a small treatise on peace of heart, both in book and audiobook form, by author Father Jacques Philippe, well-known preacher and retreatant from France. For more information on this item and many more, please visit the bookstore at 926 Boardman Canfield Road in Boardman, or call 330-953-2443, or visit their website at www.stpaulsusa.com. This book, Searching for and Maintaining Peace, is there to help you pursue peace of heart as a pure gift of God. Again, that phone number is 330-953-2443, or visit their website at www.stpaulsusa.com.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Father Jack Lavelle on music, worship, and liturgy. I think we'd like to devote this last segment of our time together basically on liturgy. We've defined liturgy. We know what it means. We know the broader term of it. Let's talk about Vatican II and the importance of liturgy in Vatican II. We know that that document was the first document that was ratified. Let's talk about that document and why liturgy is just so important for us in our communal celebrations?
Well, as you mentioned, it's the first document in the Constitution on the sacred liturgy. I think for many people, when you say Vatican II, that's all they think of. And while other shows and segments are dedicated to the other different documents and the plethora of evolution that's been brought about in the church, for most people, Vatican II is a code word for the masses in English and the priest turned around. And there's even more than that. Why those things got attention is that was the most visible and that was the most tangible of what people were expressing, because change is what people are aware of. But what really was sought was to bring everyone to a greater understanding, a greater appreciation, and again, the phrase we keep using, that greater active, conscious participation in what really is most people's involvement in the life of the church, except for when people are in need of something else, or for that, and I wish it was greater, but for that, what is a minority of every parish, the people that are overly involved in ministry and activities. For most people, that Sunday celebration of the Mass is their involvement in church. Right. And so I think the changes or the revolution that came about in the liturgy from the Second Vatican Council was to make it as active as possible for people that was their expression of their relationship with God, to really bring them into that celebration.
You know, it's interesting, as you were talking, I have this vision of the original actions of the liturgy when people gathered in those big cathedrals and basilicas centuries ago, that there was lots of milling about. People were buying and selling, were talking, and so there was a lot of action going on and not a lot of worshiping and focus on what was going on at the altar, at the pulpit. And so there's those things that happened that drew people's attention to that at particular times, like, ringing of the bells. That's when the consecration was going to start, or the Eucharistic prayer was going to begin. And so there's different things that told people, okay, this is important now. So you listen, you stop what you're doing, you stop your action, your mundane action, and focus on this. Why is that whole action so different nowadays in the Vatican II liturgy, which probably has its origin truly in the Last Supper, where they actively participated in that, taking the bread and wine and then going out and talking and spreading and enjoying the good news of the Lord. So let's go back to that whole sense of action and why action needs to be a holy action, a sacred action within the context of a sacred building.
Well, you're absolutely right. And what happened was, as the church grew, and it moved from those small communities where people would gather in people's homes. I mean, the early church, as we even hear in the Acts of the Apostles, there are stories of people who have a certain sense of wealth, so we understand that as they have a certain structure of a home, and they turn their home over to become the church, and so they're in what we would call the living room, hearing the word, and they move into what we would see as their dining room to receive the Eucharist. There's all that action going on. There's no, oh, wait a minute, I got to go do this. You come and you are fully involved as you move through the actions of the liturgy. As the church grew, and especially as we see then that it moved into the model of cathedral churches. And for many people, that was it. You would make your pilgrimage to the cathedral church. Only the bishop had Mass. And it was celebrated there. And then the priests that were there concelebrating would take the Eucharist, take communion back to fortify and nourish the people. But the Mass was celebrated at the cathedral. What happened was then, as the church continued to grow and we have parish churches, they're taking on the model of the cathedral church when they should have been taking on the model of the domestic church, that this is now our parish home and we're going to move about. So unfortunately, we kept all those trappings of, oh, just mill about, do what you want. Right away there will be divisions, the bell people versus the no bell people. And as you mentioned, there's nothing mystical or holy about the bells. It's beautiful for those who enjoy it and do it. But again, it really just signified, hey, pay attention. This is an important part. And so, you were doing whatever you wanted to do, and you looked up and you saw the host, and then you'd look up and you saw the cup. And as the language of the church was, it was the gaze that saves, because not everybody went to communion every week. So you just would look at that's all you had to do. Then you went back to your prayers, or you went back to your conversation, or you went back to buying stuff. None of that was really what was intended. So Vatican II was trying to get us, no matter how big the building is, no matter how large the community is, to reconnect with the Last Supper, to reconnect with the early church, and to be actively involved from the moment we get in the door to the moment we leave.
I'd like to pick up on something that you had mentioned. So let's talk about that whole sense of community within a building. Sometimes we get the sense that it's a lot easier to celebrate and to worship the Lord in a small, intimate group of people, as opposed to a megachurch. Why should it be different? Shouldn't it be the same?
Well, absolutely it should be the same. But I do think that a physical distance sometimes will invite someone to not feel they need to be overly involved. And yet I would, and we see it everywhere. I was always amazed at one of the first Broadway shows I went to, first of all, at how people dressed, because I would expect them to be dressed a little, just like Mass. I would expect this is something special. You paid $125 for this ticket. You've traveled to New York. Why are you dressed like that? But also, you've come to be part of this experience, but because you've got seats in the back, you think you can just carry on a conversation, and not pay attention to it. And that distance in sometimes our buildings will invite people to do that. It's why no matter how big the church is, the back fills up before the front. That we can create this distance. And I'm not knocking people that sit in the back. I've got holy and devout people that sit in the back. But it shouldn't matter where you're seated, because we need to bring to that celebration a complete attention. Whether we're in the last row against the wall, or whether we're up front, making sure Father sees us. Everybody should be actively, fully participating, and really to challenge and discipline ourselves to be part of that during the entirety of the celebration.
The other thing that I'd like us to talk about, and unfortunately in the world that we live in, we're not always egalitarians. There's this group and that group. In the same way, when we celebrate the liturgy, sometimes there's the contemporary and sometimes there's the traditional. How can we have a communion of both of them? Is that possible, and why is that important at times?
Well, I think in the times in which we are living, and maybe with fewer priests, it's not always going to be possible. I think there was beauty in all different types of celebrations, but I also think it's unrealistic to expect every parish to have those segmented populations. So while I will not advocate for one or the other, I think that if a faith community has emerged and they have a strong contemporary feel, if that works, that's great. If there's a parish that has a more traditional flavor of celebrating the Mass, that's wonderful. I think that one of the things that has to happen, and this is a whole other show, but briefly, people need to take responsibility for how they are best fed and how they best express their relationship with God in that praise and thanksgiving of Him. If it means you're going to drive 10 more miles because you feel best fed with a contemporary liturgy, and sometimes that's the music and all that, or you are a fan of the Mass in Latin, or you want to be part of this community or that community. And I would hope that it would go beyond even the liturgy, but even finding what the outreaches, what's the gifts that flow from those liturgies? What is a particular parish's charism? What are they involved in? I think people are going to have to take greater responsibility for that. We can't have parishes with 6 masses because we have the folk group Mass and the traditional choir Mass and the Latin Mass and the Spanish Mass. as you said, sometimes priests are tired after 2 Masses because we're investing ourselves in it. So I think there is beauty in all of those. I myself, and as the pastor and the priest, there's a certain style in which I have that I'm comfortable. And does that mean that I'm forcing that on people? No, that means that that's what I'm able to offer. And I would hope that it's of a sense that invites as many people in as possible. But I think people are going to have to, if they really are fed and wouldn't feel nourished and nurtured by other ways, they have to take some responsibility. And we live in a more mobile society that I think invites people to do just that.
And I think we don't want to lose focus. And one thing that my mother, God rest her soul, would always say is, I go to church not only just for the people, but I go there to be fed by the Eucharist. And that's the bottom line.
Exactly.
But yet part of that celebration of who we are as Catholics is not just to go have that communion, but to remember that in receiving that communion, that I'm doing that in communion with other people. And once I have that in me, then I leave that space and I go into this greater space, this world, and try to be that bread for others. So there's that whole sense that the experience that we have in the Eucharistic liturgy, the music, the worship, the prayer, the ambiance, whatever it is, should feed us in such a way that we take that food and we share it with the world, and we become that bread for others. In closing, what would you like to say about music, worship, and liturgy?
I think what we have said, just to reiterate it, that it is so important that regardless of what our gifts or our talents are, whether we think we're a great singer, whether we do well with contemplative prayer, or whether we feel comfortable in community with people around us, we need to bring ourselves into that celebration and allow that celebration to invite us. I'm not a singer, and so one of the beauties is if I've got 300 and some people singing on a Sunday morning, I can still feel that I'm singing, but I'm not doing a solo at a microphone. But to really just immerse ourselves in that and to find the beauty in it. One of the things that, as I said, I don't know good liturgy, but I know when I don't get it. I'd like to think I do know what good liturgy is, and I'd like to think that we do it well. But, there are good days and bad days. I love most when there's that whole sense that everybody's involved in it, and everybody's doing their part, and it's all clicked. And there's sometimes where at the very end, after the dismissal, and we're getting ready to process out, I'll turn to the deacon and say, who wouldn't want to be here today? Because it just all worked. And not just be there, but then, as you said, go out and to share that with others.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Theology 101 was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Korda.
Heaven. For Juan Diego, he reminds us